Kevin Costner stands today at 70 years old, like the last quiet flame flickering in a storm that refuses to pass. The world remembers him as the stoic guardian in The Bodyguard, the dream-haunted father in Field of Dreams, the lone visionary who carved dances with wolves out of silence, wind, and impossible faith. For decades, he was the face America turned to when it needed courage, steadiness, or the kind of hope that does not shout, but endures. But behind the calm voice, behind the measured smile, behind the gaze that once held the weight of entire worlds, lies a lifetime scarred by losses the spotlight never managed to illuminate. He rose from the dust of Linwood, the son of a ditch digger and a weary social worker, building an empire of films, legacies, and landscapes no one believed he could reach. And yet, the higher he climbed, the more violently life pulled at the seams of the world he tried to hold together. 2 marriages shattered, 7 children watching him come and go like a migrating season. Courtrooms, rumors, betrayals whispering through headlines that forgot he was a man before he was a myth. Grief that arrived too early, love that left without warning, a body worn thin by decades of stunts, storms, and stubbornness. And now, at 70, another heartbreak heavier than any injury he ever took on set. You may know his films, you may know his Oscar speeches, but you do not know the nights he spent alone with failure, the mornings he rose with nothing but willpower, or the storms that stripped him of nearly everything except faith. This is not the story of a Hollywood legend. This is the story of a man who learned, again and again, how to rise from the ruins. He was born not into promise, but into a house that leaned against the wind. On January 18, 1955, in Linwood, California, Kevin Michael Costner entered a world still trembling from the aftershocks of war, a world where working hands mattered more than dreams. His father, William Bill Costner, spent his days buried in the earth, digging ditches, repairing power lines, returning home each night with dust clinging to his hair and exhaustion pressed deep into the creases of his palms. His mother, Sharon Ray, carried the weary quiet of a social worker, her heart bruised by the stories she absorbed during the day, yet still soft enough to hum while she cooked dinner on a stove that flickered more than it burned. Their home was small, its walls thin enough for winter to slip through, yet thick with a kind of unspoken love that held the family together like invisible glue. The air often smelled of oil, soil, and second-hand hope. They did not have much, but what they had was earned. Bill's boots were always coated with the brown of California clay, and Sharon's eyes often shone with a tired tenderness that spoke of sacrifices children rarely understand until they are grown. But beneath this modest warmth lived a shadow that would shape everything Kevin became. 2 years before he was born, in 1953, the Costners welcomed a baby boy named Mark Douglas. He lived for a single day. His tiny heart, too fragile for the world, faded before sunrise. That kind of loss leaves an echo that never stops ringing. And though his parents never spoke of it, the silence became a ghost that lived permanently in the corners of their home. Bill became stricter, protective to the point of hardness, determined that nothing would take another child from him. Sharon became gentler, yet quieter, her affection folded into long glances, lingering touches, and the soft sound of her voice when she thought no one was listening. And little Kevin, though born after the tragedy, grew up breathing an air tinged with grief he could not name. Sometimes he would see his mother staring at an empty corner of the kitchen, her eyes drifting somewhere far away, as if she were speaking to someone only she could see. Sometimes his father's hands would tighten around the dinner table as though bracing against a memory. Kevin did not know why, but he felt it. Children always do. From the beginning, he learned that silence could be heavier than stone. By the time he was 12, Kevin had lived in more towns than many adults ever will. Compton, Ventura, Visalia, Orange County. Each move was a quiet surrender, another small fracture in the soft structure of childhood. The family chased stability the way others chased sunlight, always reaching, rarely catching it. Every new house meant new walls, new streets, new schools where Kevin was the kid whose name teachers forgot before lunch. He never complained. He simply packed and unpacked his life, placing his world into boxes so often that he eventually learned to live inside one. He was not the loud child, not the star athlete, not the natural leader. He was the boy in the back row, the one whose hand hovered midway before retreating, the one who wrote poems instead of answers, because poems were safer, quieter, truer. He learned early that belonging was a luxury, and some children are born to observe before they are allowed to participate. The sound he remembers most from childhood is tape ripping across cardboard. One night, as the family drove away from yet another place they couldn't afford to stay, he sat in the back seat, watching streetlights streak past like vanishing memories. Houses blurred into darkness. He didn't cry. He simply whispered goodbye to a neighborhood he had barely touched. Goodbye to the hope that maybe, this time, he could stay long enough to matter. It was childhood's cruel lesson, learning to let go before learning to hold on. But inside those quiet disappointments, something unexpected took root. A resilience that did not roar but endured. A belief that even if the world did not see him, he would someday build something large enough that it could not look away. In high school, he stretched upward, reaching 6'1", but the real growth was internal. He discovered the church choir, and when he sang, his voice trembled with longing, as if trying to release the echoes of every unspoken goodbye. At night, he filled notebooks with poems about skies, roadways, second chances, and the longing for land that did not move beneath his feet. His father's discipline became a map. His mother's quiet faith became a foundation he didn't know he would need decades later. He once said, "I guess I was used to starting over." But that wasn't about houses or towns. It was about life itself. Every new school taught him how to enter a room quietly, but leave it stronger. Every moment of loneliness taught him to listen deeply, to notice things others rushed past. And every silence taught him that the world rarely gives comfort, only chances. He would spend his adulthood chasing those chances with the kind of ferocity that can only be forged in a childhood shaped by impermanence. And perhaps that is why Kevin Costner's heroes on screen always seemed real, grounded, human. They were men who understood loss, men who spoke softly because they had learned the cost of shouting, men who carried wounds the camera could not see, men who endured. Because long before Hollywood wrote his name in lights, life had already written its lessons into his bones. He came from small houses, thin walls, quiet rooms, and a family shaped by grief they never spoke aloud. But in that fragile beginning, something eternal was born, the fire that would carry him through everything that came next. At 23, Kevin Costner stood at a crossroads that looked nothing like destiny. He had done everything right, graduated from California State University, Fullerton with a degree in business, found a stable job, wore clean shirts, smiled politely, earned a steady paycheck. It was the kind of life his parents had hoped for him, a life built on predictability and polite comfort. But deep inside, something restless tapped against the walls of propriety like a trapped bird. Every morning, he buttoned his shirt. Every evening, he clocked out. A little part of him faded. He wasn't dying dramatically. He was dying quietly, day by day, in the hollow space between who he was and who he was meant to become. The office lights hummed, The typewriters clattered, and somewhere beneath that dull rhythm, he heard a truth he could no longer ignore. Safety, he realized, was a slow kind of death. Then fate took the shape of a man with troubled eyes and a voice that had moved decades of audiences, Richard Burton. It was an ordinary flight back from Kevin's honeymoon in Mexico. Ordinary until the young man glanced to his right and recognized one of the greatest actors who had ever lived. Burton carried an aura that seemed carved from storms and old theater curtains. Kevin felt his heart stumble, the way it does when destiny walks in unannounced. Gathering his courage, he confessed the secret he had hidden even from himself. He wanted to act, but he was afraid. Burton studied him for a long moment, as if peering into the spaces between Kevin's words. Finally, with the quiet authority of a man who had lived 100 lives, he said, "You have green eyes. I have green eyes. I think you'll be fine." When the plane landed, Richard Burton stepped into a waiting limousine, swept up by the machinery of stardom. Kevin and his new wife waited for a bus, standing small in the shadow of possibility. Before the car door closed, Burton leaned out and spoke 2 words that would echo for the rest of Kevin's life. "Good luck." 2 simple syllables, but they cracked something open inside him, a door he had spent years pretending wasn't there. Within weeks, he quit his job. The world did not applaud. It turned its back. Dreams, he discovered, are quiet things. They do not walk with trumpets or promises. They walk with hunger, cold rooms, rejection, silence. He drove his battered Datsun toward Los Angeles with a single suitcase, a second-hand jacket, and barely enough money for gas. The city of dreams greeted him with indifference. The struggle that followed was not romantic. It was the kind of struggle that stains your hands and tests your pride. He scrubbed the hulls of boats, drove delivery trucks, gave bus tours of movie stars' homes while wondering if he would ever have his own home. Nights were the worst. The heater in his apartment coughed more than it worked, and he would curl up fully clothed, whispering, "Just one more day. Just keep going." He didn't dare call home. Pride is a sharp thing, especially in young men trying to become something more than their fears. Audition after audition ended with the same words, "Leave your photo." He walked miles to save bus fare. His shoes thinned. His stomach knotted from hunger so constant it became part of him. Sometimes he sat outside studio gates in the rain watching extras escape under bright lights while he remained in the shadows, unseen. Los Angeles had promised dreams. It offered silence. Still, he refused to turn back. Then, by chance, a classmate mentioned a tiny production, Sizzle Beach, USA, a cheap, awkward beach movie no one believed would matter. They needed a warm body, no pay, no guarantee, no glory. Kevin showed up barefoot, sunburned, hair bleached by the California sun, ready to work. It wasn't pride, it was defiance. When the camera turned his way, he felt something shift, not hope, a vow. But the break he longed for wasn't in that film. In fact, when Sizzle Beach was later released, long after it had been shot, he wished he could buy every copy and burn them. Humiliation carved into his early years like notches in a tree. For 6 years, he drifted through auditions like a ghost, almost cast, almost seen, almost remembered. No one called back. He was cut out entirely from The Big Chill. He sat alone at the premiere, his name in the credits, but not a second of his face on screen. He wasn't just broke, he was invisible. Yet every night, instead of surrendering, he returned to acting classes. He learned to listen to silence the way other people listen to music. He learned that rejection does not kill you, it chisels you. He learned that the world does not open its doors to dreamers. Dreams only give you the strength to keep knocking. In 1985, the door finally opened a crack. Lawrence Kasdan, the same director who had once cut him from The Big Chill, called him for a new film, Silverado. Kevin walked onto that set with the fire of a man who had nothing left but belief. When the camera rolled, he didn't act, he existed. Lightning fast, magnetic, funny without trying to be, human without asking permission. He burned across the screen like someone who had waited their entire life for that single moment. Audiences noticed, critics noticed, Hollywood for the first time looked up. He had finally stepped into the light. But what the world didn't know was that the man they were now praising was not made from luck. He was made from cardboard boxes, cold apartments, silence, and 1,000 nights where he told himself to try again tomorrow. His rise wasn't a miracle, it was survival. When Silverado hit theaters in 1985, Kevin Costner felt something new in the air, something delicate, almost fragile. Recognition. His name did not roar across Hollywood yet, but it lingered, spoken softly, curiously, like a question waiting to become an answer. For the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting to be seen. He was fighting to live up to what people had begun to see in him. 2 years later, in The Untouchables, he stepped into the role that would carve him into the stone of American mythology. As Elliot Ness, he embodied quiet courage, the kind that does not need volume to be powerful. The film made over $100 million, but its true victory was the respect it earned him. Audiences didn't just watch him, they believed him. He stood tall in chaos with a steadiness that felt almost sacred, the kind of integrity people longed for in a world that never had enough of it. Then Bull Durham arrived, a film beating with humor and humanity. And in 1989 came Field of Dreams, where he wandered through cornfields chasing ghosts and forgiveness. When he whispered, "If you build it, he will come," he wasn't talking only to the character before him. He was talking to every person who had ever built something in faith, unsure whether the world would ever acknowledge it. Those words became part of the American soul, repeated not as a quote, but as a prayer. By 1990, he was no longer the hungry young man knocking on closed doors. He was the man Hollywood came to when it needed truth wrapped in silence and sincerity. But quietly, beneath the glow of fame, something else stirred inside him. Acting was no longer enough. He wanted to create. And so he did the unthinkable. He mortgaged his own money, formed TIG Productions, took every ounce of his credibility and set it on the altar of a dream that made studio executives whisper the word madness behind closed doors. Dances with Wolves was too long, too quiet, too daring, too native, too unusual, too everything. A 3-hour Western spoken partly in Lakota, career suicide. That's what the headline said. But Kevin Costner had learned long ago that silence contains its own kind of truth. When the studios begged him to cut those long, breathless pauses, he refused. The quiet, he said, is where the truth lives. It was the kind of conviction that gets people laughed at until the laughter runs out. When storms tore down the sets, he rebuilt them. When actors quit, he kept going. When the budget ballooned from reasonable to reckless, he stayed the course. On freezing nights in his trailer, he would stare into the dark and wonder whether he had destroyed his entire life for a vision no one else could see. But visions are lonely things. They always have been. When Dances with Wolves finally premiered, it did not just succeed. It transformed him. The film earned $424 million, won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director, and took a boy from Linwood and placed him in the rare air of Hollywood giants. But at the height of the celebration, Kevin stood still. He did not feel the thunder others heard. He heard only the quiet inside himself whispering, "I didn't trust myself." The spotlight burned bright, but inside, the same small tremor remained. Maybe that is the price of climbing too fast. Maybe that is the mark of someone who has been invisible for too long. The years that followed were a storm of triumphs. In 1991, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves exploded at the box office, conquering global charts and earning $390 million. Yet critics mocked his accent with a cruelty sharpened by jealousy. He smiled politely for cameras, carrying a truth only fame reveals. Applause and ridicule often travel hand in hand. That same year came JFK, Oliver Stone's political firestorm that dared to question sacred structures. Many actors would have run from the controversy. Kevin ran toward it. Any discussion about truth can only make us freer. It was the kind of courage that divides crowds and defines men. Then The Bodyguard released in 1992, the film that would immortalize him in a way no award ever could. He waited a full year for Whitney Houston to accept the role, rejecting a $10 million salary in exchange for profit participation. It was a gamble, the kind only someone who once counted coins for gasoline could take. And it paid off, with the force of destiny. $411 million, 50 million soundtrack albums sold, $20 million in earnings, and a partnership that would echo across decades. But success has a strange temperature. At first, it warms you. Then, it burns. Friends said he barely slept during those years. By day, he led casts. By night, he rewrote scripts, edited scenes, carried the weight of projects too large for one man. He stood atop Hollywood like a king, yet inside, he felt the slow erosion that only relentless excellence can cause. Success, he confessed once, can be lonelier than failure. And he would soon learn how true that was. In 1995, Waterworld was meant to be another triumph. Instead, it nearly drowned him. A hurricane swallowed sets. Budgets spiraled into chaos. He clung to a mast during filming and almost died. Critics descended like vultures, calling the film Kevin's Gate, a mocking echo of the Heaven's Gate disaster years before. But the worst was yet to come. The Postman, released in 1997, collapsed so completely it swept the Razzie Awards for Worst Picture, Worst Actor, and Worst Director. The same hands that once gripped Oscars now trembled beneath the weight of unpaid bills and public humiliation. But even in that season of collapse, Kevin Costner did not curse the world. He went back to work. Small films, quiet stories, westerns no one else dared to make. The kind of rebuilding that requires the humility of starting over. But he knew how to do that. He had been doing it since childhood. "I've never been afraid of beginning again," he said. And maybe that was what made him great all along. Love, for Kevin Costner, never arrived gently. It came like sunlight at dawn, warm and trembling with promise, and left like a storm that stripped entire worlds bare. His greatest roles showed him as protector, guardian, savior. But in his real life, love was the one force he could never outrun, never tame, never fully keep. He first learned this with Cindy Silva, the woman whose belief carried him before fame ever did. They met as young dreamers in 1975, two college kids balancing hope and uncertainty. Cindy saw something in the quiet boy with poetry in his pockets, something no one else had noticed yet. 3 years later, they married with nothing but conviction. Their first home was a patchwork of borrowed furniture and faith. Nights tasted of cheap wine, mornings smelled of coffee and optimism. For years, they built a small, tender universe. 3 children, Annie, Lily, and Joe, their laughter echoing through rooms Kevin once feared he'd never be able to afford. But success is a hungry thing. It takes as much as it gives. The Hollywood that crowned him also consumed him. Films carried him across states, across continents. While he stood beneath studio lights, becoming an American myth, Cindy stayed home raising 3 young children with patience that slowly began to fray. Birthdays passed without him. School plays had empty seats where a father should have been. On the night Kevin stood under the golden lights of the Oscars for Dances with Wolves, Cindy watched alone at home, the screen colder than any winter. Rumors drifted from distant sets, long nights, close co-stars, whispers with no proof, but enough shadow to dim the warmth they once had. They fought to save it. Retreats to the mountains, long conversations, therapy sessions meant to mend fractures that had grown too deep. But love does not break in a day. It breaks in silence, in absence, in the slow erosion of 2 people drifting in opposite directions. In 1994, after 16 years, they filed for divorce. The settlement, nearly $80 million, became one of Hollywood's largest, a figure headlines devoured, never caring that it represented not greed, but grief. Cindy received the family home and custody of the children. Kevin kept his production company and the aching emptiness of a father now told he would see his children only half as often. That night they shared a final meal. No shouting, no accusations, just 2 hearts too exhausted to keep fighting. Outside, cameras flashed like lightning. Inside, the quiet was as devastating as thunder. Kevin moved forward carrying the ghost of that loss. For 2 years, he drifted between film sets and hotel rooms, a man learning how to breathe through the ruins of his first life. Then, unexpectedly, warmth returned in the form of Bridget Rooney, a woman whose kindness softened the edges of his grief. Their connection was brief, a small flame in a long winter, but from it came something permanent, a son, Liam. Kevin met the situation with honesty and responsibility, ensuring his child would never feel the uncertainty he once carried in childhood. The chapter ended without scandal, without bitterness, just 2 adults acknowledging that some bonds are meant to be gentle and unfinished. But the story of his heart did not end there. Fate had one more rise and one more fall for him. In the late 1990s, he met Christine Baumgartner. She was younger, composed, elegant in a way that didn't need attention. She steadied him, softened him. They separated once over the question of children, but the heart has a way of crossing back to where it belongs. In 2004, on the vast golden expanse of his Dunbar ranch, they married beneath open skies. Horses grazed in the distance, white tents shimmered. Kevin, at 50, believed he had finally found his forever. For nearly 2 decades, they built the life he had once only imagined. 3 more children, Caden, Hayes, and Grace, filled his world. Snow forts in Aspen winters, barefoot summers in Santa Barbara, movie nights under blankets. He slowed his career for them. He built horizon for them. He believed, wholeheartedly, that this time the story would hold. But love erodes quietly, the same way it fades. Work stole him again. Yellowstone demanded long stretches away. Horizon devoured his time and money. Christine began to feel invisible within the beautiful life the world envied. She missed small moments, coffee together, idle mornings, the comfort of presence. He offered stability. She wanted simplicity. In May 2023, under a sky he was filming beneath, divorce papers arrived. Irreconcilable differences, 2 decades undone in an instant. The headlines swarmed, dissecting their lives through the cold lens of numbers. $248,000 requested in monthly support, later reduced to $63,000. The prenum required her to leave the family home. Cameras waited outside. Their children moved between houses, between silences, between parents they loved but could no longer see together. Then came the photographs, Christine walking along the coast with a man Kevin once called a friend. There was no confirmation, no accusation, but pain doesn't need proof. Betrayal is sometimes just the shadow of what used to be. "I didn't want this," he told a friend quietly. "I still love her, but some things you can't unsee." And so, his second great love joined the first on the list of things he once believed would last forever. His first marriage cost him half his wealth. His second cost him half his heart. Yet even in heartbreak, Kevin Costner never stopped showing up. At birthdays, school plays, quiet weekends, he carried the weight of his mistakes not as punishment, but as responsibility. Because love to him was not about ownership, it was about duty, presence, the quiet work of being a father, even when the world calls you a legend. And this was the darkest truth of Kevin Costner's story. He could save everyone on screen, but in real life, he could not save the ones he loved most. There are truths in Kevin Costner's life that no interview captured, no headline honored, no award ceremony ever acknowledged. They lived beneath the surface of his achievements, quiet as breath, heavy as stone. From a young age, he had learned how to endure storms, but nothing prepared him for the ones that struck when fame was loudest and he was furthest from home. It began with his mother, Sharon, the gentle soul who returned home each night carrying the sorrows of strangers, but never let them spill onto her children. She had spent years reminding him to rest, to breathe, to believe in his own goodness, even when the world seemed indifferent. One day, while he was on set, surrounded by cameras, cables, and bright lights, he received a call that shattered the rhythm of his life. She was gone. No warning, no last moment to hold her hand, no chance to whisper gratitude for everything she had carried so quietly. He stood, frozen, script pages trembling in his hands. The crew continued to move around him, unaware that a world had just ended. At her funeral, he stood between his brothers, trying to stay upright as he spoke about the woman who had taught him tenderness without needing to say the word love. "She carried other people's pain so they wouldn't have to," he murmured, as if realizing too late the weight she had borne. Grief reshaped him. It softened him, deepened him, reminded him that even legends are still sons. 2 years later, life delivered its second blow. His father, Bill, the man whose hands had built fences, fixed machines, and held the family together with unspoken strength, passed away as well. Kevin was again far from home, living on film schedules and hotel rooms, the curse of a career that demands everything. The call came early in the morning. He read the words twice, unable to accept their finality. He had missed his father's last breath, just as he had missed his mother's. 2 absences carved deep into him, leaving scars that no camera could capture. "Once your parents are gone," he said quietly, "you become the parent of yourself." It was a truth he learned the hard way. And then there was Whitney. Their connection was something the world romanticized, but few understood. She was luminous, fragile, carrying the weight of unimaginable expectations. When she joined the bodyguard, she was terrified of failing, of acting, of disappointing people who saw her as more symbol than human being. Kevin became her anchor. On set, he whispered jokes to calm her trembling hands, studied her marks to help her find confidence, shielded her in ways no one ever knew. She called him her safe place. He called her a miracle. Years later, on February 11, 2012, he received the news no one wanted to believe. Whitney Houston was gone. She had been planning her comeback. She had been hopeful. And then, suddenly, she wasn't there anymore. Kevin sat alone in his home, staring at the silence that followed, feeling as though the light he had walked toward for decades had been blown out. When he was asked to speak at her funeral, he wrote his words by lamplight, pausing often as memory blurred ink. Standing before her casket, in the church where she had first sung gospel as a child, he whispered, "You weren't just good enough. You were great." And then, softly, almost breaking, he added, "And I will always love you." It was not a line from a film, it was a farewell carved out of truth. But the world rarely pauses for grief. Time moved on, even as pain settled deeper into his bones. Age arrived not as a number, but as a slow rebellion of the body. The same body that had carried him through storms on set now protested with stiffness and aches that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Years of stunts, falls, and stubborn endurance accumulated into a debt he paid daily. Waterworld burned his skin and nearly drowned him. Open Range cracked a rib. During Hidden Figures, he fought through kidney stones, pain sharp enough to bring most men to their knees. Yet he refused to miss a single day of filming. Doctors called it wear and tear. He called it proof that he had lived. At 70, he moved slower, but never with less purpose. He still woke before dawn, stepping into the cold Colorado air of his Dunbar ranch as light crept over the mountains. The past lay behind him like a long trail of victories and wounds. The future shimmered on the horizon, calling him the same way it did when he was a young man driving toward Los Angeles with nothing but belief. But there was a hidden truth beneath his resilience, a truth his children sometimes glimpsed in the way he lowered himself into a chair, in the brief wince before he straightened his back, in the quiet he fell into at night. He was tired. Not defeated, not broken, just tired, in the way that only someone who has carried too much for too long can be. Yet even that weariness had its own kind of grace. He no longer chased applause. He chased meaning. He no longer lived for noise. He lived for the rare peace found in watching horses graze as the sky turned gold. The pain, the losses, the betrayals, they had stripped him, refined him, left him with a heart both bruised and unbreakable. There is a scene described by those close to him, evening in Aspen, the sky a canvas of fading fire. Kevin stands by the fence, hands resting on the wood, veins sharp against the skin. He breathes deeply as if memorizing the moment. Behind him lies a life of storms survived. Before him lies another horizon he still wants to chase. He knows time is finite. He knows the body will not last forever. But stories endure. Faith endures. Love, no matter how wounded, endures. And perhaps that is the hidden truth of Kevin Costner's life. He has been tested by loss, broken by love, betrayed by fate, reshaped by grief, and worn down by time. But through it all, he never stopped moving forward, never stopped creating, never stopped believing there was still another horizon waiting.
Now, at 70, Kevin Costner stands at a place few men ever reach, not at the top of a mountain, but beyond it. Fame has come and gone in waves. Love has risen and collapsed. His body aches where it once soared. His heart carries memories that feel heavier with age. And yet, in this late chapter, he has found something rarer than glory: peace. A quiet, unassuming peace that comes only to those who have endured storms without surrendering their humanity. To the world, he is a legend, an Oscar-winning director, a guardian in The Bodyguard, the man who whispered hope into a cornfield in Field of Dreams, the architect of Dances with Wolves, the patriarch of Yellowstone. But when he wakes in the early blue of morning, stepping onto the frost-covered earth of his Dunbar Ranch in Aspen, he does not see himself as a myth. He sees a boy from Linwood, the son of a ditch digger and a social worker, who somehow built a life larger than the world ever expected him to have. The numbers alone sound unreal. A net worth exceeding $250 million, a ranch worth nearly as much as small towns, a Santa Barbara estate overlooking the Pacific where sunsets fall like blessings, vintage cars, 1,000-bottle wine cellar, 3 homes spread across landscapes so grand they look painted rather than built. But wealth is the least interesting thing about him. In fact, he rarely speaks of it, because everything he owns is simply a vessel for what he values more: time, land, family, stories. On that ranch in Aspen, 160 acres, stitched with pine and silence, he built not just a home, but a sanctuary. Trails wander through the woods. A private baseball field lies hidden beneath the sweep of mountains, where his children once learned how to run without fear. A skating rink glimmers in winter. In summer, the lake reflects the sky like a silver mirror. At night, when the valley glows gold beneath the fireplaces, the world feels almost suspended, untouched. It is here, among these quiet landscapes, that his 7 children form the true constellation of his life. Annie, born in 1984, a producer with her own studio, carrying his instinct for storytelling. Lily, with a voice soft enough to break open silence, singing at charity events where her father sits proudly in the back, unseen. Joe, working behind cameras, shaping stories instead of standing in them. Liam, the private soul, gentle, grounded, whose presence reminds Kevin that responsibility can be a redemption. And the youngest 3, still teenagers. Caden, beginning to experiment with music and editing. Hayes, who rides horses with natural confidence and even appeared briefly in Horizon. And Grace, bright, athletic, fiercely protective of the father she admires with her whole heart. These 7 faces, spread across decades of his life, are the pages of the story he treasures most. Sometimes, when the older children all gather at the Santa Barbara estate, they sit together in the private home theater. Old home videos flicker across the screen: birthdays, first steps, snowball fights, beaches, barbecues. Kevin watches quietly from the back of the room, the glow from the projector softening the lines on his face. In those moments, he is not a legend. He is a father marveling at the lives he somehow helped create, despite all the chaos, all the loss, all the mistakes. And it is this realization, this truth, that shapes his final act. He is no longer chasing stardom, not running toward applause, not measuring his worth by box office numbers. Horizon, an American saga, the film he risked $40 million of his own money to create, is not a monument to ego. It is a promise kept to himself, a story he needed to finish, a legacy that breathes long after he is gone. When the film premiered at Cannes, the critics were divided, but Kevin smiled. Approval was no longer the currency he lived by. "I don't need statues," he once said quietly. "My legacy is the life I lived and the people I loved." Perhaps that is the truth at the core of everything he has become. That endurance matters more than perfection. That loss carves wisdom. That pain is proof of having lived fully. That love, though fragile, remains the only thing worth fighting for. He has known triumphs, kings with envy. He has known heartbreaks ordinary men rarely survive. He has known the burden of fame and the loneliness that follows applause. But through it all, he never stopped standing back up. Tonight, somewhere under the wide sky of Aspen, Kevin Costner might be sitting on his porch, watching the last light fade over the mountains. The horses are still. The valley hums softly. His hands rest in his lap, hands that have built worlds, held children, buried parents, signed contracts, wiped tears, and endured more than they ever deserved. He has lost much. He has gained much. And in that balance lies the story of a man who refused to let life break him. For anyone listening now, for anyone sitting alone in a quiet room, holding their own pain, wondering whether they have the strength to begin again, Kevin Costner's life carries a simple message. It is never too late to rebuild, never too late to forgive, never too late to rise from the ruins. If his story has touched something inside you, leave a quiet word for him, a small tribute. Because a rich life, as Kevin Costner has shown, is not measured by what we own, but by what we endure, what we give, and the love we leave behind.